ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Dr. Primo's Biblical Teaching. This is the second session of the Antichrist, and we left off in Daniel chapter 11, verse 5. Remember, these are the things which will take place once Israel's program is resumed. So, 5 kings are fallen, and 2 more are yet to come. All right. Don't forget. Here we go. Daniel chapter 11, verse 5. And the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him, and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. And in the end of years they shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an arrangement. But she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand, nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. But out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against him, and shall prevail, and shall also carry captives into Egypt, their gods, with their princes, and with their precious vessels of silver and of gold, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom, and shall return into his own land. But his sons shall be stirred up, and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return, and be stirred up, even to his fortress. And the king of the south shall be moved with choler, and shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north, and he shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. And when he hath taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up, and he shall cast down many 10,000s, but he shall not be strengthened by it. For the king of the north shall return, and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and with much riches. And in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. Also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. So the king of the north shall come and cast up a mount, and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. But he that cometh against him shall do according to his will, and none shall stand before him. And he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed. He shall also set his face to enter with strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do. And he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her. But she shall not stand on his side, neither before him. After this shall he turn his face unto the isles, and shall take many. But a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. Without his own reproach he shall cause it to turn upon him. Then he shall turn his face toward the fort of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. That is the end of the first king of the north. Now enter the second king of the north. Now remember what Revelation said about him. The other is not yet come, and when he cometh, he must continue a short space. Now look at what Daniel says, verse 20 of chapter 11. Then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom. But within few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. And this is a short space, is it not? So what happens next in Revelation? What happens next in Revelation chapter 17? Well, verse 10 says, "And there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, one is, the other is not yet come, and when he cometh he must continue a short space." Excuse me, verse 11, "And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition." Now we see that there is an 8th, but he is already in the list of the 7. Well, the 8th is the Antichrist. What does Daniel say after the second king of the north dies suddenly? "Then shall stand up on the estate a raiser of taxes." All right, he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. In verse 21, "And in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably, and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. And with the arms of a flood shall they be overthrown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant." Verse 31, "And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate." Verse 36, "And the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself, and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done." This is exactly what Paul tells the Thessalonians. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3, it says, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Remember ye not that when I was yet with you, I told you these things?" Now what I'm after here, in all of this, once the program of Israel gets itself back underway, there are still 2 more kings that have to come on the scene before Satan's man of sin will be revealed. 2 more kings. Therefore, this is not going to happen immediately, and the setup will happen. No matter where a person is in this dispensation of grace, it can be properly said that Satan's night is still far spent. The night condition of the world has not yet been done away with. His works of darkness have not stopped. Satan's ability to bring his final goal into existence has been suspended until God is finished with the dispensation of grace. So there are 2 issues we need to understand at this point. Number 1, God has done something which has allowed him to legally suspend Satan's ultimate objective by bringing in the dispensation of grace. And number 2, Satan's ultimate objective cannot be brought to pass until after God is finished with what he is doing in this dispensation of grace. Now the 2 principles that we're looking at, God has done something which has allowed him to legally suspend Satan's ultimate objective by bringing in this dispensation of grace. Now we're going to turn to some passage to substantiate this. We're going to see some concepts and phraseology that are set in a legal type jargon for the purpose of demonstrating that God was not doing anything unrighteous or unjust or without foundation. in bringing in the dispensation of grace. Look at it this way. God started and ran a program with Israel. He's demonstrating that he was not being unfair to Israel. Neither was he breaking his promise to them when he interrupted his program with them. After all, his word and reputation are on the line. Therefore, what we will be looking at is something that God set down previously in Israel's program, a legal principle which indicated that God could lawfully stop dealing with Israel the way he had been dealing with them. And now, it is true that when this was done, it was not looked at this way. No one knew about the dispensation of grace, so nobody really looked at it that way. But as we look back, we can see the application of what was sitting back in Israel's program, which allowed God to deal with Israel in a different way if he so desired. This is the issue brought up by Paul in Romans chapter 9. Now, for those of you that are my students and have been following along, we haven't reached chapter 9 yet. But when we get there, chapters 9, 10, and 11 of Romans is the describing of the diminishing of Israel and the building of the church, the body of Christ. The diminishing of Israel so that the program, the mystery program, could be brought in. That they diminished. But in chapter 9 of Romans, Paul deals with this issue. What has happened to Israel? Now, in response to this question, Paul covers a series of faulty thinking issues that could come into your mind. One of these issues is there unrighteousness with God? Romans chapter 9 verse 14 says, "What shall we say then? Is there unrighteousness with God?" And it's Paul's response, "God forbid." Has God treated Israel unfairly by bringing in the dispensation of grace? Has God shortchanged Israel or treated her in an unfair or illegal manner? Paul's answer is God forbid. Now this also applies to Satan. Just as Israel has no right to cry foul because of what God has done, shaped her into a vessel of dishonor, neither does the adversary have the right to cry foul. Satan cannot come along and just say to God, "You do not have the right to keep me from bringing to pass my finest hour." When it comes to the issue of interpreting his program with Israel, interrupting. When it comes to him interrupting, I was thinking of people interpreting things, but when it comes to him interrupting his program with Israel and suspending Satan's ability to bring his night to its fullest extent, God crossed every T and dotted every I. This issue we need to look at now. All right? What God did in order to be perfectly just in suspending Satan's next move and bringing in the dispensation of grace was in something he did on the cross. What God did was not made known at the time. The time that it was being accomplished on the cross, it was not made known. And it was certainly was not made known or spoken of before the cross. In fact, it wasn't even known immediately after the cross. The truth of what God accomplished on the cross was not made known until he did interrupt his program with the nation of Israel. It wasn't until he raised up the Apostle Paul and revealed it to him that it became known. Romans chapter 11 verse 11. "I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? God forbid, but rather through their fall, salvation is come unto the Gentiles, for to provoke them to jealousy. At their fall, Israel's fall to the same level. At their fall, they fall to the same level as the Gentiles. Now, there's two issues in Romans chapter 11, verse 11. The first one is Israel did not fall because they stumbled. All right? And number two, Israel would not remain in that condition permanently. Now, we've already talked about the first of those issues. The second issue is one that is believed by many today, that they have various ideas that all include God is doing through Israel. Replacement theology. Well, that teaches that the church has replaced Israel. If it has, then God is unrighteous, because even though he made a provision to deal with them differently, he did not make a provision to replace them with Gentiles. You cannot, for those of you living in this dispensation of grace and have become a born-again believer, a follower of Jesus, you have, unless you're born Jewish, you will never be Israel. You have never been Israel. You'll never be Israel. God will not replace Israel with you. I'm sorry, but he's not going to do it. That would nullify every covenant he ever made with them. Oh, and by the way, you are not part of any covenant that he made with Israel. You're only a beneficiary of the new covenant, which is yet to be ratified. Anyway, I'm getting off on a different tangent here. As you progress through the chapter, Paul tells us that even though Israel has stumbled and has fallen, her fullness is not yet come. Misunderstanding the issue is what leads to such foolishness as being spiritual Jews, or the church being spiritual Israel. Israel's fullness has to do with all that was originally promised and covenanted to them. So Paul lays out in Romans chapter 11 that they will get everything they were promised. That God has only temporarily, and I repeat, temporarily suspended his program with them. Chapter 11, verse 12 in Romans. Now, if the fall of them be the riches of the world, and the diminishing of them be the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? Now, if you've been following the doctrine from Romans chapter 9, verse 1, to the present place in Romans chapter 11, excuse me, then you know that when Paul refers to their fullness, he is not just talking about some kind of improvement over their present situation. He's talking about all of the literal things which were promised and covenanted for in Israel's time past history. Israel will get her fullness when the mandates of the Davidic covenant have been fulfilled out in the kingdom. To point you to one example of Israel's fullness involving all that was promised to her, take a look at Romans chapter 9, verse 33. Or verse 3. Verse 3. For I could wish that myself were accursed from Christ for my brethren, my kinsmen according to the flesh, who are Israelites, to whom pertaineth the adoption and the glory and the covenants and the giving of the law and the service of God and the promises, whose are the fathers, and of whom is concerning the flesh Christ came, who is over all, God blessed forever. Amen. As we go back to chapter 11, we see that in verses 15 through 25 that Paul is describing the mechanical means in which God will one day resume his program with the nation of Israel. And we can see by what is written that there will be no problem whatsoever for God to take right up with them once he concludes the dispensation of grace. It will be as though this dispensation of grace never took place. That is how easy it is going to be for him to do that. Chapter 11, verse 15. For if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead? In verse 15, we have both components given, the casting away and the receiving of them. When God interrupts his program with them, he had no thoughts at all about not receiving them back, or even receiving them back in some lesser status. Not only will Israel take up where they left off in their program, but that is also true for the adversary as well. Now, we see that the casting away of them is the reconciling of the world. That phrase, the reconciling of the world, is what we're after. Once they're cast away, once their casting away took place, the situation in the world changed. For example, Gentiles were no longer far off and without God, with a middle wall of partition up between them and Israel as they were separated before. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 11, wherefore remember that ye being in time past Gentiles in the flesh, who were called uncircumcision by that which is called circumcision in the flesh made by hands, that at that time ye were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. Verses 11 and 12 describe who we were in time past. But now things have changed. We, Gentiles, were far off, can now be made nigh. Verse 13, but now in Christ Jesus, ye who sometimes were far off are made nigh by the blood of Christ. At the cross, God provided through Christ for that middle wall to be broken down between us and Israel. Verse 14 of Ephesians chapter 2, for he is our peace, who hath made both one, and hath broken down the middle wall of partition between us, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances, for to make in himself of twain one new man, so making peace. The twain was being Jew and Gentile. Notice that the provision for breaking down that middle wall of partition was made at the cross. God did not break that wall down until later, at the end of his extension of mercy to Israel. Verse 16, and that he might reconcile both unto God in one body by the cross, having slain the enmity thereby. Now it is by the cross that God made provision to reconcile both Jew and Gentile unto God. What God did through his Son on the cross was make it so that Israel's nighness unto him and the Gentiles' far off status no longer had to be enforced. Israel falls to the level of the Gentiles, and through the offer of reconciliation, God was able to pick them both up and bring them both into a brand new status called the reconciling of the world. Ephesians chapter 2 verse 17, and came and preached peace to you which were afar off, and to them that were made nigh. We were not going to have peace preached to us before. We were going to have wrath. So what God is doing today by offering reconciliation to both Jew and Gentile is something that God made provision for back at the cross, but did not bring it out to use it until the end of the extension of mercy given to Israel. When the wall was broken down, the Gentiles' far-off status no longer needed to be enforced. Israel falls to the level of the Gentiles so that God can pick them both up and put them in a brand new status, the one new man. This process is called the reconciling of the world. Do not confuse this with the saving of the world. This is not describing the world getting saved. It is describing the change in the world's stance or the world's status before God. The world's at odds position, the enmity, is now something that God does not have to deal with at this particular time. My goodness, I'm running out of time again already. The whole process also affected the adversary's right to do what he had earned the right to do back when God interrupted the program. What was required in order for Satan to bring in the ultimate part of his night was to have the world position itself as God's permanent enemy. He needed the world to push their rejection of God past the point of no return. He accomplished that at the end of the extension of mercy with the rejection of the witness of the Spirit and the apostles. Once the point of no return was reached, Satan would bring in his coup de grace. And God would bring to pass his day of fierce wrath in response to Satan's night. That brings us to the second issue. Now, before we discuss the second issue, let me remind you of the first. God has done something which has allowed him to legally suspend Satan's ultimate objective by bringing in the dispensation of grace. The second issue we need to understand is Satan's ultimate objective cannot be brought to pass until after God is finished with what he is doing in the dispensation of grace. To say it another way, what God is doing in his reconciling of the world took precedence over what Satan has earned the right to do. Not only in which would come first, but also with regard to the dispensation of grace being completed before Satan could move his night to its final place. How is that possible? By getting the world to reject all three members of the Godhead. Satan changed the world's position to that of being irreversibly at odds with God. That was the necessary condition he needed to produce. That was the condition he needed to produce in order to bring about his finest hour. What God provided for on the cross was to change the position of the world from that of being permanently at odds to that of being reconciled. In other words, God altered the world condition, which was necessary for Satan to take the final step in his program so radically that it altered the world condition so radically that Satan was unable to follow through on his plan. As long as God is reconciling the world, Satan's plan is on hold. And it's at that point that we are definitely going to have to pick up later. I'm out of time. Until the next time we get together. I'll do this again. May God bless you.